Hello, economics students. A couple of lessons ago, we talked about life in the old communist Eastern Europe. We talked about how things just weren't running all that well, say compared to areas in Western Europe and North America, where free enterprise was the rule of the game, and in the old Soviet Union, things just didn't work quite as well. We looked at that letter from someone who had lived in Eastern Europe under communist rule for much of her life, and she described the way the apartments were. You recall that inside someone's apartment in the Soviet Union, it was really quite nice, where they actually had ownership of the stuff within the apartment building. But once you walked out of the actual apartment into the common area of the building, you'll recall it was pretty trashed out. Remember, the elevators were pretty terrible, no light bulbs, and buttons didn't work, and the hallways were trashy, the lobbies were trashy. And we call that tendency of things that are commonly owned. You remember, when it's commonly owned, it's as if no one owns it. When things are commonly owned, they're typically not cared for well. And the term for that phenomenon is called the tragedy of the commons. Things that are commonly owned don't get treated well, and a resource that is commonly owned may very well be depleted. Because no one owns it, everyone wants to get it, and they will deplete the resource. I have here on the screen a Google Earth picture of a part of the globe. You see in the middle of the picture the Atlantic Ocean. You could consider on a global scale the oceans to also be a commonly owned resource, a part of the commons. Everyone in the world sort of owns the ocean, which of course means that no one owns the ocean, nor does anyone own the resources found within the ocean. And this can lead to a tragedy of the commons on a global scale, looking at the ocean. Now, what resources are in the ocean? There are mineral resources that can be exploited that are held within the oceans. But of course, the most common resource would be the seafood, the fish that live in the ocean. And those fish, of course, are exploited by fishermen from all across the globe. And one of the great fisheries in the world, perhaps the greatest fishery from a historical standpoint, is in the Atlantic Ocean near the coast of Canada, North America. And that area is called the Grand Banks. Okay, here's the Grand Banks, and it is perhaps the greatest fishery in the history of the world. I'll tell you just how impressive this fishery was. John Cabot was one of the early explorers of the New World after Christopher Columbus. Cabot sailed into and explored what is today Canada back in the late 1490s, just a few years after Columbus's first voyage. And he described sailing through the Grand Banks and seeing all these codfish. That was the dominant fish species, was cod. And he said the cod were so thick, so populous and numerous in that area of the Grand Banks, that it was almost as if you could step out of your boat and walk on the water on the backs of all the fish. They were so predominant there. Obviously, that's an exaggeration, but it was an incredible fishery. In fact, there is evidence that has been found on the island of Newfoundland that suggests that there were fishermen from northern Spain, the Basque region of Spain, as well as from Ireland and perhaps Iceland, who were fishing the Grand Banks and setting up camps in Newfoundland, the island of Newfoundland here, before Christopher Columbus discovered America. Of course, they kept this discovery secret because they didn't want other fishermen exploiting this incredible fishery that they had found. But most historians now believe that there were Europeans fishing the Grand Banks and setting up camp in Newfoundland before Columbus. So again, it was an incredible fishery. Now, what did the fishing boats look like at this time? Here's what fishing boats looked like really for probably several thousands of years. In fact, if you go back and read the New Testament, Jesus and his disciples were fishing on the Sea of Galilee, probably in a boat that looked somewhat like this. And these boats were continued to use for hundreds and hundreds, even more than 1,000 years. And this was what people used to fish in the Grand Banks. But then, of course, motorized transport was discovered and put in place on shipping in the 19th century. And so eventually ships that looked like this were replaced with ships that looked like this. And these kinds of ships were the dominant fishing vessels really through at least the first half of the 20th century. But you know what? These fish were commonly owned, and people wanted to get more and more of these fish. And so after a while, by the middle of the 20th century, these types of fishing boats that you see here became obsolete and were replaced by boats that looked more like this. These huge fishing boats with huge nets that could just take in a great number of fish at one time. And in fact, what started happening in this great fishery of the Grand Banks by the 1930s, it was becoming evident that the fishery was not as productive as it had once been due to the dominance of so many larger fishing boats. And in fact, not only were people catching less fish, the fish that they were catching were smaller. They weren't growing to their full potential because the fish were being caught before they were at their full growth. Now, there was some concern in the 1930s about what was happening to the Grand Banks fishery, but then World War II broke out, and fishing pretty much stopped as all the resources were used for the war effort, and the fishery recovered somewhat. But then after the war, the same thing happened. People started noticing that the fish were declining. So what did they do? Did they decide to put limits on what you could catch in the Grand Banks, which were not owned by any country? No, in fact, they didn't do that. What they decided to do was try to make boats even bigger and more efficient to catch more fish. Because guess what? If I don't catch the fish, someone from a different country very well might catch them, and then I won't get any. So the big boats that you see here were replaced with even bigger boats. And take a look here. This is actually on the right. In the center of the screen, a fishing boat. It's one of the largest fishing boats ever created, and you can see how it compares to the earlier fishing boats. The fishing boat on the previous slide that you saw would have been something along these lines, and then the earlier boats were more like this, the earlier motorized boats, and of course the old sailing boats were even smaller than that. But look at this monstrous thing. This is called a factory fishing ship, and just unbelievably large numbers of fish could be gathered using this boat. Well, guess what happened to the fishery when they started using these kinds of ships out in the Grand Banks? You can imagine that the catch just got smaller and smaller. Fewer and fewer fish were available. And here's a graph that pretty well tells you the story of the Grand Banks cod fishery. Going all the way back into the middle of the 1800s, you can see the catch by year goes up and down, but the general trend was more and more fish were being caught. Here you have a dip, and that's World War II, that dip. But then once World War II comes to an end, it starts to grow again. There's a dip here. The cod fishery is being depleted. So what do? They get better and bigger ships, and look what happened. The catch just skyrockets. Now I want to stress that the quality of the fish that were being caught were not of the same quality. They were smaller, but numerically they were getting lots and lots of fish until about 1970. And in 1970, you can see what happens. The fishery starts to collapse. They introduced big factory ships in the 1970s to try to overcome that collapse. But again, what happens then in the 1990s is the complete collapse of the Grand Banks cod fishery. One of the great tragedies really in resource management in world history was the collapse of the cod fishery. And you can imagine what that did to the livelihoods of those who depended on that fishery for their income to feed their families. It really was a terrible, terrible tragedy. But it really does illustrate this concept of the tragedy of the commons. When things are commonly owned, no one owns it. And when no one owns it, anyone can grab it and not, really care for the resource. They'll take it without concern for the sustainability of the resource. So that's the tragedy of the commons. One of the advantages then of our free enterprise system is that with private ownership of most resources, people have an incentive to care for the resources to ensure that you don't have something like what happened to the cod fishery off the coast of Canada. So what I want you to do now is check Canvas, and keeping this idea of the tragedy in commons in mind, I believe there's something for you to read in Canvas, which is actually a way to try to employ private property concepts to the management of a common resource, such as the fish in the ocean. It's an interesting concept to try to privatize a common resource and see how we can make resource management in the world better to help make sure that our resources are available to your children and grandchildren, as well as my children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. So check Canvas, follow the instructions there, and we'll talk to you later. Have a great day.